It's lovely to have you here. We only have about half an hour for this conversation. So I'll start saying, let's be a little bit informal. Let's not, let's dress down a bit. It's only half an hour. So everyone come up a bit. Let's get closer. And let's have a conversation. There's so little time that, in fact, there's only one way for me to introduce my honored guest, Ronnie Screwvala, who I'm just such a great fan of. Especially you were responsible for producing one of my favorite films, The Namesake, which my wife will tell you is the only film I've ever cried in because I really connected to the character. But let me read to you what a young blogger wrote about Ronnie. And this sums it up in a nutshell. Come on, everybody has to move up. This is a conversation. Let's all get involved. The Indian media industry has very few barons. Ronnie is among that handful of them. What sets him apart is his nature, which is jovial and approachable. But do not go by that innocent face, because he's one shrewd businessman and knows his game and plays it well. Now, this is I think he's a sixth grader who wrote this on his blog, and I had to read this. If one looks at his career graph, you would notice that he seems to know exactly what to buy and what to sell, and at what time and rate. Today, he's forayed into every single medium of media, be it entertainment or news, and you'll soon hear about mobile, movies, television. This is the man we want to listen to, not just because of his success, but also because of where he comes from and where he's figured out the formula. Ronnie.
Hi.
It's great to have you. It's great to be here. Give me a sense, tell me about the world of mobile, and tell me about how the world of mobile is beginning to affect you.
Well, it's funny because everyone, when you look at media in India, everyone, till about 2 to 3 years ago, would always talk about movies because that's really Bollywood, and everyone thinks of that as the biggest picture. But I am quite pleased that everyone's now looking at the fact that this is singly the largest growing mobile market in the world. Just from a technology point of view, till about 5 years back, you used to wait for almost a year to 2 years to even get a telephone line. But today, the mobile actually represents in India a completely different sense. I mean, it's common knowledge that we are the youngest country in the world. But I think what the mobile instrument actually represents is the sort of emancipation or the liberalization of the youths. Because in a joint family, very rarely would you be able to actually have a phone conversation unless you had your mother or your grandmother listening into the conversation on landline. Now you can step out and do whatever you want to do. So from content consumption to interactive consumption to a plain conversation to person-to-person interaction, the mobile represents the actual liberalization of the Indian youth.
What does that mean?
As an opportunity, as a business opportunity?
Well, actually, what does it actually mean in practice?
Well, it actually means that basically because of that, you found that there's an entire explosion of the entire consumption of what you want to do. They look at this now as their piece of communication. As you also know, while we are the fastest growing mobile market, we're also the slowest internet and broadband market, and that hasn't really progressed very far. And actually what you're finding now is that more and more of internet is getting consumed on the phone.
And what sort of impact is it having on other areas of medium, like music, for example?
Well, I think music is in the strong DNA of India. So it's music, it's Bollywood, and it's cricket. I mean, I think that's the DNA if you were to represent the content canvas of what India represents. And it's literally that. It's not as broad as sport. It's just cricket. I don't think you'd be able to step out of that facets. So, and I think if you look at music, this is one of the most unique parts in the world where the #1 music company in the world, in India, is not a music company. It's not Universal. It's not Sony, but it's a telco. It's a telecom operator. And that's because very uniquely we use what we call ringtones. So essentially, instead of getting a ring on your phone, you can download your favorite Bollywood tune or a Western tune, and actually it plays back to you as your ringtone or if somebody's calling you. Now that, in a small fraction of about 3 years, is $1 billion of revenue per year is what the Indian youth is spending just to download ringtones.
What did that used to be before?
Zero.
Zero.
I mean, the entire music industry in India is about a $600 million industry, and now it's grown with a separate $1 billion just on one single aspect, which is called ringtones, which in its sense represents that when we actually move forward with 3G and 4G, and when bandwidth becomes a little bit more accessible, if you look at just music consumption, this is on audio, not on video yet. It's not 3G. So just on audio consumption, if that's the representation of what the Indian consumer is willing to pay, I think we have some good years ahead of us.
How has that impacted your business, for example?
Well, I think because our business straddles youth, it straddles broadcast channels, movies, and television, and everything has music in them, it's a natural priority for going forward. But I think what it represents is the fact that for an Indian consumer that otherwise has been very reticent to pay for content. And I think for most people, when they look at India and they say, well, look, I understand it's a great market, and I understand that, and I've been asked a lot of times that Bollywood is such a large brand, but at the end of the day, it's not more than 1% of the global box office of cinema. And I think that is correct, because the Indian, by and large, as their DNA, has not been very used to paying for content. So our cinema tickets are about $1. Only in the last 5 years with the advent of multiplexes has it become $4. But by and large, still, 7 out of 10 people will consume a big screen content on the small screen, and most of that is free television, not paid television. So if you look at that economics, and then you move to the mobile and the broadband sphere, you will find that the opportunity for us to be able to monetize that is going to be very much more different.
Now wait, do the Indian youth have more to spend on media than they would have before?
By and large, I'd say till about 5 years ago, the broad segment, 11% of surplus income was spent on leisure and entertainment, and that's moving to 20%. And that tilt of 11 to 20 is only happening because the younger audience is using their disposable income more for consumption than for saving. And I think that's in any growing economy. When you move from saving to a consumption economy, that's when you're really going to see, you know, the needle move.
Now, in practice, for you, what are they willing to pay for? What are they not willing to pay for as a result?
Well, I think most Westerners, again, talk about the fact that, you know, video on mobile, question mark. And I'm saying this is a very unique marketplace, and it's a very unique country. I mean, the Western parts, most of the time, for America and for Europe mostly, I would say, they grew up with a lot more advanced broadband and a lot of clunky mobile phones till Steve Jobs came along. So there wasn't really too much of a pleasure to consume content on the mobile. But I think if you look at India, it's much more the Japanese and the Korean way. So either it's going to be used for content which is self-generated, which is much more person to person. But I think more in terms of social, more interactive, more community-based. I think this will be the bedrock of all content, whichever way we use that. Now, it could be content that's already produced, but repurposed, retagged. Or it's going to be content where it's going to be discovered in a different manner. And I think the right discovery platforms are going to be the ones that are going to make things very rich in a marketplace like India. But mostly it has to be interactive, it has to be personal, and it has to be community-based.
Where do you fit in that ecosystem?
I think our DNA as a company is the way content. I think wherever we've grown, we've looked at the younger audience, we've looked at their taste. I think the fact that we moved from not being in the movie industry 7 years back to being the #1 studio in the country came in because I think we anticipated the change of what the core audience, which is the 16 to 34, what do they want to see, what do they want to consume? And I think that's where we come in. Our DNA is much more to see what content they'll want to consume there. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to produce original content. It could be repurposed, it could be heavily retagged content.
That's very interesting. And you brought this up. I mean, one of the interesting dynamics is that young Indians, they might not have any of the ingrained tastes. They don't have any legacy issues. Now, is that a plus or a minus? And how do you leverage it?
Well, I think it is true that it would not have too many of the legacy issues, but I think it would be false to assume that the Indian youth does not necessarily have strong tastes. I think that there are some very ingrown cultural habits, family values. Your mother is a very strong aspect when it comes to that, you know, maybe like the Italians, etc. And then you've got other segments. You've got, again, back to the core content of entertainment and sports, specifically cricket. These are legacies that actually continue through a certain period of time. Strong family values, strong entertainment aspirational values. And third, very strong aspirational values. They want to participate, they want their moment in the sun. And I think if you take these three aspects, they make for a very different dynamics of what the content could be for the future.
That's very fascinating. You've built, you may be best known in the West, perhaps, for bringing Bollywood to Hollywood with The Namesake, and you have other projects in the works as well. Do you see such cross-border, cross-cultural phenomenon as the future in media?
You know, I think, and there's a fair amount of that conversation that happened today, that actually in every sense, content is very localized. And I think the grammar that people speak or the grammar of the storytelling in each region is very unique. So I think to a great extent, Hollywood specifically in America, because of their early run, and primarily because of their very, very strong domestic market that allows them the budgets to market and pound the world with that marketing strength, is the only reason why you've seen that migration of content. But otherwise, for most others, where there's a strong, deep-rooted local content, which is in India, Hollywood has always looked at as foreign language films.
Yeah.
So Hollywood has never gone past the 5 to 6% of Indian box office. There's a reason for that. So I think very local markets, Japan, Korea, or this part of the world, would be very strong and local.
And do you see yourselves moving into that? Is this a growth area, number one, for Hollywood? Is it a matter of teaming up with you or copying what you're doing?
No, I think for the Western people, I think it's more the fact that they can bring in a lot of their global distribution and marketing prowess when they're looking at this part of the world, and that would make sense. But I think they need to be quintessentially local.
That's very interesting. And quintessentially local, if you're a Western production firm, say, in India, what does that mean?
The scripts and storylines have to be Indian. I don't think necessarily you're going to be able to migrate the best Hollywood stories into India. That would be quite rare and unique. But I think the ability to market globally, to be able to build a franchise, these are things that I think the Western world is much more acclimatized to. They've understood scale, and that's what they would bring to local markets, including a market like this.
So do you have any projects in the works along those lines?
Well, I think it is. We have a strong strategic relationship with Disney, who are an investor in our company, and I think we work very closely with them to see how we can use that in many aspects to what we do.
Give me an example. Do you have any projects in the works?
Nothing that I can speak of other than the fact is that, for example, their basic policy now is to do less for more and see that everything that they do in the content field is franchisable. And I think that's a good enough guideline for us to look at some of what we do in our content, especially since we're looking at spanning audiences that look at movies, television, mobile, and almost all other tablets. More and more, that thinking is, how do you extend it across platforms, and how do you preconceive it in that manner?
But then, doesn't that necessarily mean also that there's a slight change that's happening, where what was once an Indian film is now a genre? It's Bollywood, isn't it?
I would say that for anyone looking at content, if you keep looking at a crossover market, there's more likelihood you're going to fail, because it's going to be an orphaned product. You have to be in your home market first. You have to be dedicated and loyal to your home market. Otherwise, you're going to be feeling very orphaned if you're trying to do something for an audience that you don't know much about.
That's remarkable. We have about 15 minutes left, and I'd like to really open this up to the audience. And we'll encourage if we have some questions. Let me start in the back, because I'm going to notice you soon. I can't miss you. Back there. Can you state your name and organization?
Steve Santamaria. Earlier, James Cameron talked about stereoscopic 3D movies. What do you see in the uptake of stereo 3D in Bollywood and in the local market there?
Stereoscopic 3D.
Well, again, it needs to be local. I think technology is only an augmentation of content communication. So I think 3D from that perspective is an augmented technology for what we would look at in India more than anything else. I think your storyline and your content has to be very strong. It is true that Avatar has paved the way for a completely different revolution when you're looking at creating content. But I think if you look at many of the others that have come in after that, they've actually tried to ape technology first without necessarily getting the content right, and that's where they fail.
Yes.
Well, we have about 12,000 screens in India, which for a country with 1 billion is still under-screened. And we will have now almost 2,000 multiplex screens. But by the end of next year, about 800 of them, 800 screens will be 3D capable, which is not bad.
Ali.
Thank you. I feel guilty asking you, with your cough, but I'll go ahead and ask the question. You mentioned storytelling. I think we must have heard it for the fourth time today. Now, it may apply in some areas. I'm not sure how much it will apply to us. There is nothing more I would like to sell more than my race and my religion. But to underestimate what's going on, right now we make 1/3 of every single international news bulletin in the world.
Yes.
We really export our content, if you may say. I don't think our story needs to be dramatized more than it's already drama on real world. Cartoon, drama, I know it helps the crossing, building bridges, all of that. But is it time? I mean, right now we need cameras to show pain as well to show hope. We look at those people and see how those people, they've been living for all those decades. We don't see enough of that. And maybe digital content, because it has that personal touch, it can do that for us. We can inspire people, in my opinion, by showing that, the pain as well as the hope.
So what's the question?
The question is, the storytelling right now about the values, about the religion, about the race, in my opinion, it is not the time. Because you can't watch all this destruction about the Arab world, yet, you see a movie talking about the values of the Muslims. You need really to go and show the pain, show the hope, and let people, understand what is this region all about. Thank you.
Well, sir, I have a few. These are all my personal points. There's no right or wrong as far as that is concerned. Firstly, I do believe there's never a good time or a bad time. I think it's the conviction of what you have and what the story you want to tell at that time. This world is going to be an evolving world as we see it. I don't think what you've seen yesterday is not what you're going to see tomorrow. And I think it's going to be a constant series of surprises and learning that we'll all go through. So there's never a bad time or a good time. I think when we talk about storytelling, I think we have to be very, very cautious that it cannot be preaching. Storytelling is very important, that you are going to be extremely true to the ability of being a natural situation. People have to be able to identify with that. They have to empathize with it. Crying is a much more of a successful formula for a very successful movie than laughing is, because then you've got the best and the strongest emotion for people. So I think the resonation has to be on the story, not necessarily if you're trying to give a moral science lecture. And I think now is as good a time as any other from any aspect.
Ronnie, do you find yourself telling stories maybe differently today than you would have, say, 10 years ago?
I think Indian cinema tells stories very differently. And actually, we're telling stories in two different ways. We're telling story for the mass India, and then we're telling stories for what I would call a slightly more emerging India. And it's not a fine line between the two. It's a little bit like, the independent cinema in Hollywood and then your blockbusters in Hollywood. And it's a different language, it's different storytelling. And you do have a King's Speech and a Black Swan breaking out and making $200 million, but not all of them do, but they're strong in storyline. So I think when we've harnessed Indian cinema as UTV specifically, I think we took the course of saying, what were the Indian audiences like? And I think they're definitely liking a high sense of entertainment, but with that, a very high sense of realism. And if you can capture both of the two in a strong grammar, but the grammar has to be local. The way you say it and the way you communicate, if you're not used to a non-linear narrative in this part of the world and you start using that, that's different grammar. That'll be alien. That could be a reason why it doesn't work at all.
But does it speak to also his point that might be a way to begin to tell that story?
Absolutely.
Is that there are people that want to hear the mainstream story, but there are many people that also want to hear your slice of life, what story you have to tell in your own way.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, you have to understand that you have it for a core audience. Who's your core audience? If it's too small an audience, chances are you're not going to succeed either. So it has to be for a broader framework, a broader community or a broader segment, either through a language or a culture or a religion.
So how many, let's say, mainstream films would you be producing versus what would be the breakdown in your company?
Well, we'd like to see that all our films that are strong in storytelling are actually now more and more mainstream. As much as, a Fox Searchlight wants to make mainstream films, they don't want to make hard house films. Sure. So I think that's the sort of, you're pushing the envelope for a wider sense of an audience as you go forward. Now, you will always have the pot boiler, the entertainer, the Bollywood musical, the comedy, slapstick, that'll always be the ones with a star cast.
Yes.
But I think the storytelling can be done. And I think the differentiating today, even between blockbusters and not, is either that it's a caper or a genre of a certain sort, or it's got a blockbuster cast. That's what segregates a big movie from a small movie, not necessarily a big story from a small story.
That's very interesting. That's a very important point. Any other questions from here?
Yeah, hi.
Your name, please.
Angela from Earth TV. I'd just like to know, has user-generated content taken off in India? And if so, is it monetized? Obviously, you said video to mobile and broadband issues, but I mean for television, for example.
Yeah, it's a good start. I think there has been a start in that. It's early days. It's interactive in many aspects. I think the internet and the broadband is not that high from that perspective, and the mobile is much more a use of a communication. But I think, so the DNA is very much there for it to explode. Monetization-wise, I think if we keep depending on advertising as the sole source of revenue, I worry, because I do believe that for the kind of investment that everyone's making into these new technologies, I don't think advertising spends worldwide are going to grow so exponentially to support that. And therefore, there has to be strong subscription bases. And that'll be the challenge in a country like India. But the mobile phones creates a very good platform for collection, as you can see from a bill. And that's not something that has been prevalent. We have a very nascent credit card system in the country. We are not used to paying our cable bills on time. And therefore, to that extent, mobile and broadband will allow a different kind of commercial vehicle. And the only reason why I mentioned that $1 billion comes in ringtones is because just for a 10 rupee click, you subscribe to a ringtone, and if you don't unsubscribe, you get billed every month.
Back here.
Much has been Peter Shao from Orb Media Group. A lot has been said about the Indian diaspora all over the world. You know, how much does that figure into your calculation for returns outside of India's borders?
Well, we're the second largest migrant population in the world outside of the Chinese. Figures-wise, it's between 30 to 33 million people. Obviously, their spending power is 10 times more than that. So that would represent 330 million potentially out of the billion Indians when you look at the propensity to spend and earn. They're widely spread, but by and large, geographies are good. And I think there's all our movies get released day and date to almost now 40 countries around the world. And about 60% or 70% of that is the Indian population. A balanced 20% would be what I would call the South Asian population, which includes Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. And 20% is actually a crossover population. And actually, there is not a single DTH or a cable operator in the world now not carrying some mix of an Indian channel, an Indian movie channel, an Indian general entertainment channel, or an Indian news channel.
Hello. When you look at your balance sheet, how much of, what percentage actually is derived from offshore revenue?
In motion pictures, actually, it's between 15 to 20% now of our revenues comes from outside of India, which is quite significant. It was about 5% 5 years back. I think in television, it's still very nascent compared to the fact that we're a much more advertising-dependent economy when it comes to broadcasting in India. But if you look at just the subscription, I'd say 50% of the big networks that operate in India, 50% of their subscription revenue comes from international.
That's right. Go ahead.
I'm allowed to have one more question.
One last question.
I love the idea of the orphans that you spoke about movies without a target audience that finds neither an audience internationally or in India. You know, where does the namesake fit in?
Actually, the namesake was really written by an Indian-born American called Jhumpa Lahiri. It was a Booker Prize winner. And I think it was much more to resonate for a Western audience. So we were very clear it was for a US and a Western audience and not for an Indian audience. If it was, we wouldn't have made it in English language.
That's interesting. Still here.
Hi, Nasser Batley. I have two questions. First of all, what is your strategy for the online video sector in India? I mean, with the IPL, that's been so successful with like sports, but specifically with the content that you produce, what are you thinking about in terms of online video distribution? And then two, social gaming. What are the opportunities in social gaming in India and for UTV?
So I think as far as online is concerned, right now, most of the broadcast channels can and could be streamed, but the potential is very low because the broadband speed lengths are very low. So essentially, you've got apps that can download 15, 20 minutes of that. But the trend is positive. I think the key challenge is going to be whether we can monetize it or whether it's going to go back to the advertising-based. I think if it's advertising-based, we're a little bit in a setback mode because basically in our broadcasting model, anywhere else in the world, 50% comes from subscription, 50% comes from advertising. But in India, it's 80% advertising and 20% subscription, barring a few channels. I remember for 5 years having discussions with HBO long before they came into India, and they just didn't want to come into India because they would have to insert ads in what everywhere else in the world they didn't put ads into their channel. And finally, they succumbed and they did that because that's how the dynamics of the market work. So I think if we translate that into the online and make it all advertising, it's going to be a problem. So it is critical that the broadband platforms that are coming into the country, and when we get into 4G, that the subscription revenue has got to creep into the DNA of the Indian consumer from day one. And I think we want to be part and parcel of that. Second, to talk about the content then specifically to that, I think it's not going to be just your normal content. I think consumption of a full 2.5-hour movie is not going to be that. I think it's going to be very uniquely tagged, very uniquely repurposed content, which is going to come about from a social network and a community of people that is going to be able to look at being more that here's a community of people that likes this kind of content, and therefore how do we take it forward? And I think that's going to be the differentiator for the Indian market. And it's going to be a very interesting marketplace because I think once we get subscription, you'll find every single global player wanting to play in the Indian market because frankly, we're one of the last bastions left that is actually going to be able to have this kind of growth year on year for the next 10 years. Social gaming-wise, I think we're absolutely set for a Zynga equivalent in India. There's no question about that. Absolutely no question about that. There have been simplistic games. Most of them have been foreign imported games, very few local games being produced. That's changing. 3G bandwidth will allow us to play a little bit more sophisticated games. And the Indian consumer is going to pay for games. They will.
We have room for one more question.
Hello, Islam Darwish. I can see some very interesting similarities between the Arab world and India in terms of demographics, rich culture, and as well as the opportunities and challenges in terms of content consumption. So India having progressed so far, what tips would you give to the Arab world in order for the industry here to flourish in the future?
Well, I think the lessons are pretty much there in every context. I think when you're looking at the television diaspora, it's very different. I think there's a fair amount of local content that's happened here. People have a question of whether the production values are high. But let's face it, we're living in a world today where a local channel is juxtaposed next to a very high budget, high spend international channel. So production values are going to show up. But finally, even with those production values, you are finding that your local audiences will consume your local content more because the context is local. So I think it's a question of a slow process. Stay loyal to the local storytelling and to the local cultures. And I think production values is something that has to keep going up when it comes to the small screen. I think the interesting part is that as the mobile and broadband and the newer content comes in, it's going to be shorter and shorter. And when it gets shorter and shorter and much more interactive and much more user-generated, I think you're going to find that almost all the barriers that have been around between the big guys and the small guys, there's going to be a completely democratization of content. Clearly and absolutely, the technology here is leading to a democratization of content. Democratization from a point of view of how it's getting consumed by the consumer, and also that tomorrow anybody can walk out there and make a 3-minute content, something that you would never dream of 5 years back because you wouldn't know where to put it.
Well, just to sum it up, the youth market is growing. You're going to reach them on their mobiles. The subscription model is the way to go, not on advertising. And it's all about the story you tell. Thank you so much for all of your time. We did it in half an hour. I am very impressed. It was a whirlwind. But Ronnie Screwvala, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.